I broke the habit of recent years last night and watched what must count as the worst edition of BBC Question Time in at least 40 years. The worst presenter and a panel so anonymous that someone said the audience were more recognisable than those sitting up front on the panel. And my conclusion is, if I can't get on that BBC Question Time panel, well, I might as well give up and start my own. And that's what I'm going to do. So, just watch this space on that. I did a pilot for it just this week. And I asked the studio audience for a show of hands as to who still had faith in democracy. And only 3 members of a studio audience of medium size, not as big as BBC QT, but not a small number. Only 3 people had any faith in democracy. That's a very dangerous place to be, because democracy is the worst of all possible systems of government, except for all the others, as Mr. Churchill said. How have we come to this parlous place where our Parliament is held in odium and contempt by the public, where our government is a laughingstock even around the cabinet table, even amongst the members of the government? How have we reached the stage where the votes of 17.5 million people, the largest number of people ever to vote for anyone or anything in our entire history, are still 3 years on not implemented, with no sign of them being implemented and no sign of an end to the tireless, indefatigable efforts to wreck, subvert, destroy the decision that our people made 3 whole years ago. It's been coming, though, for longer than that. The Iraq War broke a very considerable part of the backbone that connected government to people, that transmitted democracy between the people and the government and the people. I said it would at the time, and very few believed me. But something died in British democracy when we were led into a devastating war which is still raging on the basis of a pack of lies told to us by our elected leaders, transmitted by our mass obedient media, proselytized by all our commentators and columnists. Something died in Britain. Of course, it was a real death for 1 million people in Iraq and counting. But other things too. The loss of faith in our institutions. The parliamentary expenses scandal, when thanks to the Daily Telegraph it was revealed that hundreds of our members of Parliament were no more than thieves, stealing from the public purse, claiming for things they never bought, didn't need, or that no one else in the country could dream of claiming from their employer for. Flipping their houses, pretending their main residence was a room and kitchen in their constituency or in London, when the opposite was the truth. Buying properties on the public's dime and renting them out to each other and pocketing the rent. I could go on. Trust me, I could go on. The loss of faith in our media, which Iraq exemplified. The loss of faith in our police, in our justice system, in the civil service. One institution after another, like a domino effect, falling over, taking with it further faith that the people once had in the institutions of this country. So tonight we're going to be talking, of course, about Brexit and its continued betrayal. Of course, about the Tory party and the hapless Mrs. May getting ready for some long country walks so she can escape, presumably, the round of press conferences and sofa television that her predecessor, David Cameron, is about to embark upon to promote his memoirs. Tell me they're launching the book in a piggery somewhere in the Cotswolds. That's what I heard. But one thing is for sure. David Cameron and Theresa May have broken the back of the Conservative Party. That much is astoundingly obvious. The Conservative Party was founded in 1834, imagine. The Duke of Wellington, the victor of the Battle of Waterloo, was still there in Parliament when the Conservative Party was founded. But if the latest opinion polls are right, the Conservatives are about to score the lowest vote since they were founded in 1834. Again, I predicted this and people laughed. I said Brexit will disrupt everything. It will break the Tory party. They laughed. Oh, how they laughed. But they're not laughing now. Of course, that doesn't mean the Conservative Party cannot come back. And if, as I imagine they will, unless they are completely bereft of any remaining political sense, choose Boris Johnson as their next leader, they might get a bit of a bounce. And certainly if they choose one of these brown box-suited apparatchiks whose name nobody knows, who've also declared themselves as runners, riders in the donkey derby that's about to start in the Conservative Party, they'll definitely be finished. They might be finished even with Boris. But at least with Boris, they've got a chance, a wild card. And I'll be interested in your take on who the next Conservative leader will be and what difference it will make and what impact it will make on the British electoral scene. Is Jeremy Corbyn getting ready for the off too? Sometimes it seems like that, feels like that. Certainly his enemies have currently absolutely carte blanche, open season. They openly defy him, even those sitting at the very closest to him in the shadow cabinet, the shadow foreign secretary, Emily Thornberry. She has her own policy for Brexit. John McDonnell has another. Sir Keir Starmer yet another. Last night I was on This Week, only a few weeks of that left, unfortunately, with the legend that is Andrew Neal. And there was a Labour MP. I had no idea she was a Labour MP. I'd never heard of her, set eyes on her, or ever heard her speak before. But when she took her chair next to Michael Portobello, I assumed that she was the Labour MP, as indeed it turned out she was. Except her entire purpose on the show was to rubbish. Actually, on the verge of slander her own leader and her own party. So I sometimes think the Labour Party itself is beginning to disintegrate. Certainly, as a wise man said on Twitter earlier this evening, Jeremy Corbyn is under ideological house arrest. He's not in control of these events, which are momentous and will set the course for British politics for the next 50 years. And he is for sure no longer, if he ever was able to, call the shots. Now, I don't blame him for that. Of course, I would have, and he should have, said and done things differently from time to time on issues large and small. But I don't actually blame him, because he's actually a prisoner of Tony Blair's Labour Party. Tony Blair's Labour Party are in control of events, and Mr. Blair is laughing all the way to the bank. We'll be talking also about Iran. I warned last week that war with Iran would be far from swift, but very terrible. There are signs this day that President Trump has paid heed to the obvious fact that Iran has the means, the capabilities, and, above all, the will to fight back against the United States, and in particular its satrapies in the Persian Gulf, the oil and gas-rich satrapies in which U.S. forces are currently building up, docking their naval assets, parking their B-52 bombers. In those Gulf satrapies, not a single one of them containing a semblance of democracy, freedom, liberty of any kind, but the West's best friends in the Muslim world. Iran will set them all on fire. I promise you that. As soon as hostilities begin, the oil wells in every one of these satrapies will be on fire, and the Straits of Hormuz will be blocked, and there will be no oil flowing anywhere to Western economies. This is a big deal. And so if Donald Trump is having second thoughts, as seems to be indicated this very day, if he's blaming John Bolton, it's time he sacked John Bolton and Elliott Abrams. They led him into a ridiculous fiasco in Venezuela, and they tried to do the same again in Iran. We'll be talking to an expert, the head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, about the Iran issue in the course of the next 3 hours. We'll be talking, as I say, about democracy, and we'll be talking about ideological conflict. And so in the last hour, we'll be talking to the man I now believe, and this is a big claim, is Britain's top spy novelist. His name is Edward Wilson, Ted Wilson. His latest book, South Atlantic Requiem, is the first that I'm aware of, a novel set in and around the Falklands War, the last time that we were at war in that hemisphere. He was a decorated soldier in Vietnam, a U.S. Army officer, but he escaped to Britain, and he's written 5 absolutely outstanding spy novels. If you like your spy literature to be less blood and more intelligence, Edward Wilson is your man. Clive Ponting, by the way, said his book, The South Atlantic Requiem, is on a par with John le Carré. That is a big claim, but it's one I already know to be well-founded. The rest of the show is yours, of course. You can call us, 0344 499 1000. You call us, we call you back, and it needn't therefore cost you more than a penny or two. You can tweet me at George Galloway, at talkRADIO. Don't forget to at both of us. Or you can email through the website at talkradio.co.uk. Or you can text the word talk and then your message to 87222, though that will cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. 0344 499 1000. Now we're kicking off with democracy in all of its ramifications, ideological, philosophical, as well as the practical politics of the day, particularly set on the Brexit topic, of course. We're joined by Professor Matt Cole, a political expert of great repute and a fellow in history at the University of Birmingham. Professor Matt Cole, thank you very much for joining us.
Evening, George.
I don't know if you heard my opening remarks, but I did a straw poll amongst, I guess, around 40 people maybe the other day, and I asked them, how many of you have faith in democracy as a system? And only 3 people raised their hands. It's my thesis in this discussion that we have reached a real crisis in democracy in this country. Would you agree with that?
Well, we've reached a crisis in the system of government in the country, but people mustn't confuse the system of government of this country with the democracy. Democracy, as the great Fabian historian G.D.H. Cole said, is not a matter of voting. It's nothing to do with voting. It's a moral relationship of one person to another. You can see it in terms of certain procedures, and you can say, well, yes, if there's a parliament and people elect it and it's accountable, then yes, you can call that a democracy. But most of the dictatorships of the world satisfy most of those criteria. It's the spirit in which things are done, it's the context in which they're done, and it's the faith people put in the system that makes it a democracy.
Well, let's look at the one we have, in which I sat for the best part of 30 years. First of all, and it's too little discussed in my opinion, half of the parliament is entirely unelected. It is a collection of placemen and women, flatmates of political leaders, donors, more and more donors to the major political parties, people who are in a way superannuated in the House of Commons and are encouraged to make way for a favoured parachutist candidate and in return they get a seat in the House of Lords and so on. So that's one part of our parliamentary estate. An entirely unelected chamber, a very expensive one, which fulfills little useful function. But the House of Commons itself, the best way I can put it is this, Matt. When I went into it more than 30 years ago, it contained quite a large number of people of substance, of significance. There was a lot of not also, but quite a lot of people, 100 people plus, that you would look at walking along the corridor and say, wow, that's so and so. It's my perception that the Parliament has got smaller. The stature of the Parliament has got smaller. And whether you agree with that point or not, the one thing I'm certain of now is that Parliament is held in, if not in contempt, then in very low opinion by the public in the country. Would you agree?
Yes, I wouldn't want to pass comment on the value of any individual members of Parliament, and to be fair, quite often people look a lot better in retrospect and seem a lot more important as historical figures than they do in the course of their own lives. So I don't want to talk about the value of the individuals, but the reputation of the institution of Parliament is undoubtedly lower than it used to be. One of the best measures of this is a study called the Hansard Society's Audit of Political Engagement. It's an annual register of, it's a pretty serious survey of what people think of various aspects of the political system. And it's shown for the last 10 or 15 years a constant decline in people's trust in Parliament, their respect for members of Parliament. But this is something that's been going on for quite a period of time. I mean, it's interesting. Back in the 1980s, one of your then colleagues in the House of Commons, Teddy Taylor, the late Teddy Taylor, used to say when opening speeches that he regretted the fact that when he'd become a member of Parliament originally, back in the, I think even in the 60s, his parents had been absolutely delighted and had gone up and down their street telling everybody. Now his children were going to university. They had to confess to him that they didn't reveal to their new friends what their father's job was because it was too embarrassing. And that was a sign of decline that had been going on for a time. And when you think about how many people turn out to elections, it used to be up in the 80s, quite regularly in the 1950s, 80% or more. And now it's down in the 60s. On a good day, it's been down as low as 59% when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. You think about the membership of parties. It used to be in the millions. Individual card carrying.
I remember there was more than 1 million in the Conservative Party. Yeah, and it was a great marriage bureau.
They used to say the Young Conservatives was the best dating agency in Europe just because it was the biggest. There were 150,000 people in the Young Conservatives. Now, these were institutions that were not just party political doctrinaire institutions. They were ones that shared values, but through them they had a reach into the public. One member of the electorate in 10 was a member of a political party, and so it was a relatively normal thing to be a member of a political party, and normal people talked to members of political parties about what their party was doing, and those people took the information up the chain to their local councillors, to their trade union officials, to their local MP or their candidate, and the sense of a political capital binding everybody together was much stronger. Now that has gone into decline through the 70s and the oil crisis and the economic difficulties there, through the 80s and the disillusionment with the Thatcher government and the economic crisis there, through the sleaze of John Major, through the Iraq crisis, and of course then expenses. All of these things in their way have not just caused disillusionment with the public, but the public have thought, well, actually, this just proves we were right. People often talk about the expenses scandal as being the cause of people's disillusionment with Parliament. I don't think it's true. I think the expenses scandal was a bit like somebody who distrusts their partner actually finally finding the evidence, somebody else, and saying, look, okay, I have my suspicions, now I've got it absolutely clear that this isn't working.
Now, this is not confined to Britain, is it? And one of the things that I think motivated the rather parlous vote for democracy in the straw poll I mentioned, of only 3 people having faith in democracy any longer, was that we had just been talking about the US democracy, which brought us Donald Trump on a minority vote, and in a contest costing billions of dollars, across the 2 main parties, in which the 2 candidates were someone widely feared and the other rather ridiculed, and the ridiculed one was successful. Given how parlous the state of democracy on both sides of the ocean, you can see, can't you, why people in other countries, the ones that we're often attacking, sanctioning, even occupying, in the name of the very democracy we ourselves are finding more and more unsatisfactory.
Yes, of course. Any American president who finds himself elected with fewer votes than his opponent, and of course it's happened twice recently, it starts out from an ironic position the minute he talked about representing the popular will, although it often doesn't stop the current American president doing that. No. The disillusionment with democracy is not just present in Britain or the United States, if by democracy we mean the current political system. We're seeing outsiders, populists, emerging on the back of the economic crisis of the last 10 years in Turkey, in France, in a wide range of parties that haven't got to power yet, but which represent a real challenge throughout Europe, as we'll see in the European elections.
Yeah, in Italy, Hungary, Poland.
Yeah, these are not all necessarily parties of the right. There are populist reactions against the current economic challenges and the effects of austerity. We have to remember, I mean, this is not an unusual pattern. The conditions of economic crisis generally, historically, tend to produce political instability, and that produces a backlash from the general public in some form or other. It might be in the form of Oswald Mosley, although he wasn't particularly successful with it in Britain, or his partners in the rest of Europe. It might be in the form of a turn to the right with Thatcherism in the wake of the economic crisis in the 70s. It might take the form of Macron, or it could take the form of Corbyn. All of these are attempts to say, look, we need a singular, clear message to represent public interest. The difficulty is crafting that message in the right way to be able to form a constructive programme that can be put into effect in government.
We've been fortunate in Britain, and I suppose you could argue it's a tribute to us that the far-right excrescence of populism has never really caught on here. Mosley didn't catch on. His successors in the 60s, 70s, 80s didn't catch on. There are, of course, other pretenders to the throne of Mosley, but they're not even of the stature that he managed to obtain. The British people don't like fascism, partly because we fought it and were for a time the only people fighting it, and it's been othered successfully in Britain, I would argue, and hence someone who is really just a right-wing libertarian and economic nationalist like Farage is ridiculously accused of being a fascist. But in other countries, in France, for example, Le Pen is ahead of Macron in the polls, with Mélenchon, the left leader, trailing quite a way behind in third place, and with the equivalent of the Labour Party not even registering on the polls. The French Socialist Party that held the presidency many times in my lifetime is now polling under 5%. It's quite possible that far-right governments will come to power in places like France, isn't it?
Well, we have to look at the challenge in France, to take your example. The Front National, or the now rebranded Front National, have come second in 2 presidential elections. And on the occasions they did, they were very soundly beaten by a coalition of all the other political forces. So I think that it would be, although it is heartwarming and reassuring to rightly point out that the far right have never made it to any position of political credibility. The closest they got was Nick Griffin being on Question Time, and that was the end of the story for his particular version of neo-fascism. The reason that far right groups get a different sort of profile in other countries is partly to do with the electoral systems and the pattern of elections and the institutions. So if you manage to get yourself 15 or 20% of the vote as a candidate in a French presidential election, you can then go through to the next round and you face off against everybody else. And Macron, and in the previous case with Jean-Marie Le Pen, Jacques Chirac, managed to consolidate the great majority of popular opinion.
Yeah, he got about 80% of the vote. That's but right. Of course, in next week's Euro elections in France, it's distinctly possible that Le Pen will win them.
Well, that is possible, but that if it happens, it will be because Le Pen has rebranded the profile she's offering and has distanced herself even further from her father's tradition. And we, of course, have parties that, let's not avoid the controversy. We have parties which take a very strict view on immigration, which draw on some controversial feelings about immigration, but which are in or close to the mainstream and are capable of getting a sizable vote. So the names of parties and the systems by which they get their profile should not be confused with the culture and the admittedly and happily relatively remote threat of them coming into power. I think there is part of the British constitutional tradition which doesn't like extremism or what is perceived as extremism of either side, and that has helped to keep the far right out, and the tradition and the history of having fought fascism helps to keep the far right out. But I don't think we should be complacent about that, nor do I think we should take too much pleasure in pointing at examples of it in other countries in such a way as to avoid the threat of the wrong kind of scapegoats being named, the wrong kind of problems being raised, and the wrong kind of solutions coming out of that.
Well, I'm grateful for your time. If you'll give me just a few more minutes, I'd like to explore what we could do to improve it. You made I think it was G.D.H. Cole you were quoting, that democracy is not about, certainly not just about every 5 years putting an X on a ballot paper. But in a way, that's kind of what it has become, because there's no real means of holding parliamentarians to account. Zach Goldsmith tried to introduce a more comprehensive private members bill for the right of recall. In the end, it was a truncated version of that we've had, which has been put into practice a couple of times. But the right of 10% of your electorate to recall you over anything, over, say, for example, Brexit. If you were representing, and there are some, I won't name them, who represent areas where more than 70% of the people voted leave, but their Member of Parliament is playing a leading role in wrecking what more than 70% of their own constituents voted for. As things stand at the minute, you have to wait until 2022, and then in the context of a national election, to pass your judgment on that Member of Parliament. What couldn't we, in this electronic age, make electing people and recalling them more easy? Couldn't we? Why do we have to vote on a rainy Thursday in a school? Can't we vote over a weekend like they do on the continent? Can't we vote electronically? We can transfer thousands of pounds between banks electronically. Why can't we vote electronically? Shouldn't we be talking about a really big overhaul of democracy?
I think, it's interesting what you say about only voting once every 5 years. It was Rousseau who said that the English only experience freedom once every election, and the use they made of that made them disqualified for any further extension of it. The process of voting, and what you're talking about here is processes, whether it's electronic voting or voting more regularly or having the right of recall. Those are essentials, and those essentials can be made more sophisticated and extensive. And certainly the right of recall, I think, is in a very limited form, considering the controversy that was stirred up by the expenses scandal and some of the incongruities, yes, of the Brexit scenario. But what matters in the end is not those processes, provided they exist in a basic form. It's the faith that they will produce the right response from the representatives that is the key thing. People can vote, MPs can vote against what their constituents want, as long as their constituents have faith that they will be able to make a choice to get rid of them in the relatively near future, and that they know there are ways of getting their opinion across to that Member of Parliament and making them rethink their position through political parties or through the press or through campaigning organisations or trade unions. Bear in mind, we used to have a Parliament in which 100 members were sponsored by trade unions.
I was one of them. Proudly.
We had far more working class members of Parliament. We've actually got a less representative Parliament now in terms of social class than we've had probably since the beginning of universal suffrage.
Yeah, without doubt. Yeah.
It's the only underrepresented declining group of people in the House of Commons, underrepresented as you've gone through Labour and Conservative parliaments, is ordinary working people. There's a tiny handful of people who have any experience of ordinary life in there, and the ones that there are there do not have any kind of mechanism. They don't have a process for renewing confidence. And if I were to make an analogy here, it would be to say that your hopes for using procedure to improve things are a bit like the hopes of a person who wants to improve their romantic life by using a dating app or by going online or by using all sorts of new mechanisms. Now, those things do improve the prospects of making contact. They don't mean you're going to have a successful relationship at the end. The successful relationship relies upon something much less tangible, much less constant, and that has to be worked at by both sides of it all the time.
What a wonderful metaphor to end on. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Matt Cole from the University of Birmingham. Let's take our first call of the evening from Jake in Northampton. Jake, welcome.
You all right, George?
Yeah, good.
Good. First of all, I've been a big fan of yours for years. You pretty much got me into politics when I was 15 years old.
Oh, wow.
On the TalkSport days.
Oh, those were the days, Jake.
Yeah, Carl and Plasto.
Yeah, God rest his soul, yes.
Yeah, I've seen that piece of years ago. The shame he just didn't survive
it was a week.
Weren't it, before?
He passed away a week before I returned to the radio.
Yeah,
unbelievable. I spoke at his funeral. I remember him fondly.
Yeah, I think I read something. I don't know if it was a eulogy you gave to the Plasto Point.
I think it was, yeah, it was, yeah.
And you said about that he led an incredible life, hadn't he?
Oh, totally, yeah. He was down and out for 20 years, Carl, sleeping on the streets.
It's crazy that someone who's, obviously
with
not
such
a university,
erudition and knowledge and eloquent, amazing.
In a way, it's a crime. It's a crime that it got wasted, really.
Yes, indeed. There's, of course, millions of Carls over the generations, yeah.
Yeah, did you ever find Fred the cabbie? Do you remember?
No, I didn't, and I'd love to. I can only surmise that he's doing a long stretch somewhere, or he's left the country, or God forbid that he's passed on, because Fred, the wisest cabbie in Christendom, was a feature of the talk radio shows. And
there's another great guy called Tony. He was a big fan of Cuba. You'd always
I still hear occasionally from Tony. He drives. I think he may even live in Cuba now. He certainly took his taxi there.
It makes sense. Yeah. Oh, great. But
Great
I was
days.
thinking about, it got me into, I ended up doing a degree in politics, probably because, to be fair, I've learnt more over the years listening to you on radio than the 27,000 I've spent, loan-wise for uni.
Well, thank you for saying so.
But yeah, I'm a Labour Party member. I joined when Corbyn was elected because, it's the first left-wing leader in my life. But it's very hard now because you just think, the whole membership, they may be lefties to an extent, Corbynistas, but they are so passionately in favour of a second referendum, which includes, I would happily have a referendum if you said Norway, Canada, no deal, you choose, or May's deal, you choose between that. But as soon as you put in the Remain, you're just betraying the original vote.
Yes, quite so, yeah. Yeah, quite so. If you put Remain on the ballot paper, it's a betrayal of 17.5 million people, and they're not going to take it. They're not going to take it lying down, as politicians surely already know.
Yeah. Well, you see, I saw Farage. I can't remember what city he was in or town he was in, and you've seen working class people, normal people, probably people who, I don't know, Lord Adonis or Gavin Esler would be appalled by.
Yeah.
They'd run a mile. But they were sitting there saying, "God, give them hell, Nigel." Because. And I will vote Brexit Party when it comes to the election, even though I'm a member, because I don't know what you do with the Labour Party when you have a membership that believes that. And because Corbyn, they all joined the party for Corbyn, so you think if you educate them, espouse the beliefs that he held for 30 years with Tony Benn, Bob Crow, Michael Foot, you'd think they might understand.
Well, I think that Corbyn is under house arrest. He's certainly under ideological house arrest. He's not able to say what he really would like to do, what he really would like to say. And my only complaint with him, Jake, is he didn't do anything about that when there was a chance to do so. He thought that by appeasing, by retreating, by surrendering, by abandoning his friends.
Because he's a pacifist, isn't he? So it's hard for him to confront. He's a very strong man. I would never say he's a weak man. Because
no, he's not weak. No, he's definitely not weak.
Punch after punch for 4 years.
Yeah, no, he's not weak.
You could add Luciana Berger and Diane Abbott's abuse, and I think you would still have more abuse of Corbyn than them two put together. But
without doubt.
Nobody talks about the abuse Corbyn suffered.
Corbyn has taken more abuse than any other politician in history.
Strong man.
And I include Myself, Ken Livingstone, Tony Benn, Arthur Scargill. Corbyn has taken more and for longer. So he's definitely not weak. But his failure to... There were some... I think when the history of this comes to be written, and I hope not, but it might be that it comes to be written quite quickly now, quite soon.
Yeah, and Williamson was thrown under the bus, wasn't he? I mean, there have been people, was it Wadsworth?
Mark Wadsworth, yeah.
Wadsworth, that's it. Yeah, I mean, there's people who were... And he could have stood up and just said, no, I'm the leader of this party. I've been elected twice.
Well, those words never cross his lips, and neither does he act as if he's the leader. He takes the approach of Stanley Baldwin. I am their leader, I must follow them. Well, that's not what a leader does, you see.
No.
A leader, John McTernan, the former aide to Tony Blair.
Yeah, Blair,
he put it, you remember he put it on one of my shows. He said, Blair would say, I'm your leader, and I'm going over there. And it's up to you whether you're following me or not. But I'm your leader, and I'm going over there.
Yeah.
A leader doesn't say, okay, lads, comrades, brothers and sisters, where is it you want to go? And then they tell him what to do. That's not a leader. I'm sorry, it really isn't a leader. If you're elected as a leader, you're elected because you represent a certain direction, a direction of travel. And if you don't actually take that direction, if you don't make that journey, how can anyone follow you? So when I was abandoned, when Wadsworth, when Walker, when above all, Chris Williamson was abandoned.
He was the person who would fight for him to the last. And you need people like that.
Chris Williamson supported Jeremy Corbyn more than any other Labour Member of Parliament. And he put his shoe leather where his mouth was. He tramped the length and breadth of this country, talking to audiences all over this country, proselytizing for Corbynism. And then they got rid of him in an hour. 1 hour it took for Williamson to become a non-person.
He's persona non grata, according to the PLP.
Yeah. Well, where is he now? I'm on Twitter a lot. I have a lot of followers. Where's the name Chris Williamson? I find myself, and I'm not even in the Labour Party, I find myself being the one to remind people, hey, where's Chris? So you see, that's not leadership. That's not leadership. It's not leadership to say, oh, well, I'm the leader, but this is a matter for the subcommittee of the Democracy and Membership Committee and the subcommittee of the subcommittee of the subcommittee, and it's up to them. And I'm going to say nothing. I'm going to make no recommendation. I'm not going to fight for him. It's not my business. That's not leadership.
Sometimes I wonder, do you think John McDonnell, he has got that bit more steel about him? He's got that bit more, maybe even his nastiness. Jeremy Corbyn is a nice man. I don't know if you could say the same about McDonnell. But maybe that's what you need for leadership. I don't. And he's still a leftist.
John McDonnell would certainly agree with that. He wishes that he had run, but then he would never have got the number of nominations required to get on the ballot paper.
I remember, according to him, he's a Remainer at heart. But I don't know if he'd have said that 20 years ago, though, or even 5 years ago.
Well, you see, this is why I can't. This is why I could never. I give you this notice now. I could never support John McDonnell. Because that is a falsehood. John McDonnell is not a Remainer at heart. If he is a Remainer at heart, he's never explained when he became one, how he became one, why he became one. The problem with McDonnell is he forgets that some of us know him very, 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 that's 3 veries. Here's another one. Very, very, there's 5 veries. Very, very well. We know him too well. He's not a Remainer at heart. Still less is Jeremy Corbyn a Remainer at heart. And McDonnell can reinvent himself as many times as he like. I no longer care anything about him. But when he's reinventing Corbyn, when I happen to know what he's reinventing him as isn't true, then I've got to conclude that John McDonnell has joined the list of those trying to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. Jake, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope I added to your already voluminous knowledge of politics. Let me read any messages I can. Here, Dizzy says, George, I understand Fred is alive and well. I haven't seen him for a while, but you're correct. He's great. Can we put out an all points alert then? Fred the cabbie, the wisest cabbie in Christendom, who used to illuminate, enlighten all of our shows every single week. Any more messages here? Here's my old friend Marie. No, I can't really read these. So let me just say that that's the first hour by, but the second and third hours beckon. I remind you again of the telephone numbers. It's 0344 499 1000. You call us, we call you back. I promise you it won't cost you more than a penny or two. And first-time callers, women callers, callers who disagree with me are prioritised. You can tweet me at George Galloway at talkRADIO. I just don't have the tweets on my screen right at this minute, but I will when you come back. You can email through the website at talkradio.co.uk, and you can text the word talk followed by your message to 87222. It's the mother of all talk shows. The Battle of the Broadcasters coming up on the 22nd of June. Me in the red corner and the President of the Independent Republic, Mike Graham, in the blue corner. It's at the Comedy Store in Soho in London. I think you'll find it's going to be quite a show. It's the mother of all talk shows, here until 10 o'clock tonight.
Unbridled conjecture, opinion and debate.
Order!
The mother of all talk shows, George Galloway on Talk Radio.
Now, the war in Iran that we feared even 24 hours ago may have taken a step back from the brink. At least that's my reading of the mood music coming out of Washington. It's quite clear that there are significant differences in approach, if not of intention, at the top reaches of Donald Trump's administration. After the Venezuelan fiasco, many felt that it was on and upwards to the Persian Gulf, and what could possibly go wrong in amongst the great oil fields, reservoirs, oceans of oil and gas in the world. Earlier I spoke to Dr. Rusby Parsi, who's the head of Middle East and North Africa programme at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs. I started by asking Dr. Parsi what he thought of the current state of belligerence between the US and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Dr. Parsi, the prevailing feeling over the last few days is that conflict was beginning to look inevitable. Now perhaps there's a slight rowing back in Washington, at least on the part of the president. What do you think's actually going on the Potomac?
Well, I think there's obviously some differences between different parts of the American administration on how far they are willing to go in this escalation and what they're willing to risk. And I think Mr. Trump in particular is keen on not getting himself involved in yet another war in the Middle East. The question is whether he can avoid one if other parts of his own administration, if you will, entrap him in a situation that might lead to one.
Yes, I mean, for example, I was on a BBC television programme last night. Just before I joined the discussion, unfortunately, the presenter, a very respected one, Andrew Neal, said he'd just come back from the Gulf, and sources there told him that the so-called attack on these Saudi oil tankers was mounted by Iranian frogmen, and it was a carefully calculated threat and so on. Now, whether it was or whether it wasn't, if it was, it's obviously a danger. That kind of thing can trigger a kind of Gulf of Tonkin response. And if it wasn't, it indicates someone's looking to create a Casus Belli.
Yes, well, I mean, I think the problem at the moment is that the two sides aren't really on speaking terms in any sense. There's no direct channel between them. So whether there is an accident or something done intentionally, there are very few immediate ways in which they can de-escalate that kind of situation and make sure that it doesn't spin out of control.
There was some indication that the Swiss were prepared to mediate. Do you think that can go anywhere?
Well, I think if both parties agree on that, and I think there are indications that they do, then it's good, because at least that means that they have an intermediary that both trusts and has experience of these kind of situations, who can help them to kind of walk back some of the more belligerent statements and ideas that they've had. Let's
walk it back then, Doctor. The harmony broke out during the Obama administration. Money changed hands. The signatures were on the joint deal. It was internationally guaranteed. What is it that's thrown this off track?
Well, I think the basic flaw, if you will, is that everyone expected the next American president to honor the previous one's commitments, which is, a natural assumption to make, but in this case, it went very wrong. Now, Mr. Trump, I don't think he necessarily knows the details or cares that much about the deal as much as he wants to undo whatever Barack Obama did. There are others in his entourage who have a much more clear ideological line in why they want this particular deal to implode, and that is obviously because they do not accept any kind of even remote normalization of the relationship between the United States and Iran.
But usually there's a pretext at least put up as a reason for these kind of sudden changes, dramatic changes in state policy. But you're better informed than me, but I've actually not seen a remotely credible reason for the United States to pull out of this deal.
No, because there is none. I mean, you can say that there are things that the Iranians have done over the last couple of years that are highly problematic when it comes to the region. But when it comes to the confines of this particular agreement, they have adhered to it, and everyone agrees on that. So even the Europeans are not convinced, if you will, by the American arguments, because they don't have a leg to stand on.
So it's really a kind of punishment for events elsewhere, isn't it? Events in the Yemen, in events in Syria, reverses for US policy in the latter case, and a kind of enduring problem in the former.
Yes, to some degree that those are the most immediate reasons. But there are hardliners both in Iran and the United States who, in a sense, feed off having this institutional enmity continue. So they are in their comfort zone when they can predictably point to the other party and say they are doing bad things. And so there are politicians in Iran who make a career out of that, and there are obviously politicians in the United States who make a career out of that.
Now, the prospect of conflict is a truly horrifying one. It's certainly horrifying the British government. It's horrifying the European governments. The US and them used to speak in stereo, more or less, in the Iraq War, for example, the Afghan operation. But now this is, if not mono, then the other speakers are distinctly smaller. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Israel.
Yes, I think this is, to some degree, an even bigger disagreement than the Iraq War, because this, in a sense, indicates some structural changes in the transatlantic relationship. And I think neither side really knows what to make of it, because for the last 70 years, that relationship has been the bedrock of the way the Western Europe and the United States have created some kind of order. You might not like it, but that's the order that we've had in the world. And so we are at the juncture where we don't know to what extent that will continue. It will most likely not continue in the same way in any case.
If there was a war with Iran, it would be no small war, would it? Because the Iranian mentality is quite a nationalistic one. To my surprise, on visits to Iran, I've thought them to be more Iranian than Islamic, more Persian, more nationalistic, if you like. And national unity in Iran would likely I think, prevail over whatever differences exist in the country. And Iran is not a broken-backed, sanctions-soaked, divided, disunited country like Iraq was.
No, that is true. I mean, there is obviously quite a lot of discontent with the way the government in Iran or the system in Iran works, or rather doesn't work. But I think when it comes to these kind of issues, there is a rally around the flag dynamic, and I think we're already partly seeing it. And I think even if there was a war, and obviously the United States would win that war in a military sense, I don't think the outcome of it would be to the benefit of anyone. It would definitely not be to the benefit of Iranian people. And I don't think the United States or any of the neighbors will like the results either.
No, because Iran has the capability of striking all, and I stress all, of the United States allies in the area. And the oil fields of America's closest allies would be likely on fire and pretty quickly. The Straits of Hormuz interrupted, if not entirely closed. This would have grave implications for the economies of United States allies.
Yes, I mean, if we go to a full-scale, all-out war, the repercussions are going to be epic, if you will. I think the calculation at the moment on both sides is that they might both need to make some kind of escalation in order to show their seriousness and that they can deter each other. The big question mark is whether they can then contain that escalation before it spins out of control and becomes an actual war.
What's your, I know you're not a betting man, Doctor, but on a scale of 1 to 10, what's the chances that we're looking at a shooting war?
As you say, I'm not a betting man. I would just say that in general, politicians tend to overestimate their brinkmanship skills. So I'm not comfortable with a situation where everyone is somehow expecting the other side to back off. And everyone is showing and flexing their muscles in order to get the other side to back off. That usually just feeds each other rather than that they all understand that this is dangerous. That being said, we have to remember that there are also calmer voices on both sides, and let's just hope that they will prevail if we come to that situation.
If Donald Trump were to pick up the phone, who should he dial? Rouhani or Khamenei?
Well, in the long run, if there's going to be any kind of agreement between the United States and Iran, the supreme leader needs to get involved. But I think at this point, what the Americans also need to understand is that they have shot their own credibility into nothing. So whoever he calls first is not going to be the supreme leader because he's not going to take him seriously. He will have to go through the chain before he gets to the big man.
Very interesting. Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for joining us, setting the scene for this debate tonight on what's happening between the US and Iran. Brad Bowman is the Senior Director of the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies, Centre on Military and Political Power, and he's been kind enough to join us now from Washington, D.C. Brad, thanks for joining us on the show.
It's my honor and privilege. Thank you.
Now, you heard, I think, Dr. Parsi's interview with me earlier, so you're already aware that where once both sides of the Atlantic were akin to a stereo broadcast on conflicts in the past, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, that's no longer true. There's virtually no support in Europe. And I include Britain, which is not quite in Europe, half in, half out, as you know. There's no support for a war with Iran. That must be a factor that needs to be taken into account in Washington, doesn't it?
Well, thanks for the question, and thanks again for the opportunity. Let me start by saying I think the transatlantic alliance, which is perhaps best epitomized by NATO, is one of the great grand strategic assets of the United States. And anytime there is friction or disagreement within that alliance, I don't think that's good for the United States. It's not good for Britain. It's not good for Europe. It's not good for international security. So when those tensions arise, I think America rightly takes those seriously. I think, with that said, I think much of the commentary in recent days about what's going on with Iran is a bit breathless and overheated. I think, the deployment of additional U.S. combat forces to the Middle East during periods of increased tension is a rather common and prudent step. I mean, the Obama administration deployed aircraft carrier task force, a bomber task force to the Middle East. Sometimes there's a suggestion that American leadership and combat power is a problem. I don't think U.S. destroyers sailing through the Strait of Hormuz in international waters is akin to warmongering or is akin to starting war. I understand some of the concerns, particularly in Europe, about National Security Advisor Bolton and the president, frankly. But I think it's also important, if we're going to try to be objective and fair, to look at the facts. And the facts are that we've had a deployment of the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group. We've had the deployment of a bomber task force. These are things that the Obama administration did all the time. So, and you've had key individuals like Secretary Pompeo who said, we're not seeking war. So I think we should just. I think some of the commentary is a bit over the top.
You didn't mention the B-52s now stacked up in the biggest U.S. military base in the world in Qatar. That's a rather alarming development, isn't it?
No, actually, sir, I did. I mentioned the Bomber Task Force twice, and that Bomber Task Force includes the B-52s.
I beg your pardon. I thought you were saying Obama. We're two countries divided by a common language, as Oscar Wilde said. I beg your pardon on that. So we've got a build-up of naval assets, a build-up of aerial power. We were told by Bolton, either on or off the record, that we were talking about 120,000 ground troops being moved to the area. That would all constitute a very alarming escalation, wouldn't it, Brad?
Yes, sir. And again, I think I'm glad you raised that, because that's, I think, another example of where some of the commentary has been a bit overheated. The job of the Department of Defense is to have war plans. It's their job to be ready for virtually anything. It's the job of the Secretary of Defense to submit possible courses of action to the White House senior staff and ultimately to the president. If the reporting is accurate, that's what Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan did. I was not in the room, obviously, but I would assume that there were a number of courses of action presented, and then you saw a lot of the reporting fails to mention what the president subsequently said after that. He said, no, he called it fake news. And
yes,
then he said,
he seemed to be suggesting to me, Brad, that fake news was included some of the news coming out of his own administration.
Yeah, it wouldn't be the first time that a U.S. or, dare I say, another administration had different voices in it and was not always speaking with one voice. If that's the charge being leveled at the U.S. administration, I'd say guilty as charged. It's a bigoted agency with different opinions. Leaks occur, different principals disagree and make their cases privately and sometimes publicly. So that would be not newsworthy. But I think we have to just step back here and say that the best way to deter war, we all want to avoid a war with Iran. I think anyone who's reasonable would say, generally speaking, war with Iran would be a very bad thing. The question is, how do we respond when there is terrorism, when there's aggression, when there's concerning moves? Well, I think the deployment of U.S. combat power, if done carefully and prudently, by no means seeking to take the first aggressive step, is a way to deter war. And so I think some folks on the other side have it exactly wrong. This is a way to prevent war, not to create it.
I get the impression that Donald Trump is cross, a bit angry about the way in which he was. I think he thinks he was led up the garden path over Venezuela. He was told that certain things were going to happen in Venezuela and then they didn't, and he feels that it's left him looking foolish. My take, and you're closer certainly in proximity than me and also with access than me, but my sense is that one of the first casualties of this might be John Bolton.
As a result of what's happened in Venezuela, you mean?
No, well, Venezuela, and then the perception that spread around the world remarkably quickly that the United States was about to launch an attack on Iran when it probably isn't.
Yeah, I think it was just to be, try to be as objective as I can. I think it was a little bit unusual for the National Security Advisor to make the statement that he did, and so that that the fact that he made the announcement came from him rather than through more normal channels probably raised some alarms, and then there also are some perceptions about his reputation. But I also know that a lot of newspapers and airtime are sold by highlighting divisions within the administration. But in the end, I think it's important to look at the facts and look at the actions. The deployment, as I said already, of a carrier strike group, of a bomber task force, these are fairly routine things. If done prudently, can have a positive rather than have a positive effect rather than starting a war.
Now, Donald Trump is the most communicative president that you've ever had. I mean, he's never done communicating, usually on Twitter. Why doesn't he pick up the phone? Why doesn't he call the president of Iran? I mean, after all, if he can hug the little rocket man and defuse tension on the Korean Peninsula, why can't he share a halal burger with Rouhani after the breaking of the fast, of course?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would just remind your listeners, who are no doubt well informed, that the whole purpose of the Trump administration's max pressure campaign is to bring the Iranian regime back to the negotiating table in good faith, to try to establish a better Iran deal. So the Trump administration would say, and I'm by no means here to represent the Trump administration, I'm just explaining their viewpoint here, their goal is diplomacy. Diplomacy is a means to achieve a better Iran deal. So any suggestion that the Trump administration is not ready to engage with Tehran is false. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the max pressure campaign, to come back to the negotiating table. So some people might. You think they may. Some people might have their temper improved by the sight of American bombers and American destroyers, but some people won't. And I hazard a guess that the Iranian leadership are amongst those that don't. And as for back to the negotiating table, Brad, there already was a negotiating table and there was a treaty signed. And every other signatory to it continues to adhere to it. But it was a unilateral act of the United States to withdraw from it. So it kind of reduces the moral pressure that you have to bring somebody back to a negotiating table that you've just kicked over. Sir, I understand your point, and I appreciate the point. There's a couple problems. There's just a factual correction, if I may. From the United States perspective, it was not a treaty. I think that was a mistake. It was never ratified by the Senate. Had it been ratified by the Senate, you would have seen a better agreement. One, in my view, I spent the last 8 years working as a national security advisor in the U.S. Senate, and I can tell you confidently it would have been a better and more sustainable deal had it been submitted to the U.S. Senate for ratification. It was not. It was not a U.S. treaty. And because that did not happen, there were fundamental flaws in the agreement. One, they never properly dealt with the previous military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. Completely left terrorism off the table. As we know, Iran is the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism. It lowered the bar on Iran's ballistic missile program. It included sunset clauses. Iran claims they never want to have a nuclear weapon, and yet they insist on these sunset clauses, which is interesting. And the inspection regime is incredibly weak, depriving independent IAEA inspections of key military sites. So there's at least 5 major flaws with the program.
But you say, Brad, you say there are 5 major flaws, but nobody else saw them. I mean, what are the British government, the German government, the European Union, the United Nations Security Council? Are they all idiots? They can't see flaws that you can now see?
No, sir. I would never put myself up as omniscient, and I would never insult my allies and partners like that. By no means. But I would respectfully disagree with your premise that no one else saw them. If you go back and look at the conversations, debates, and literature at the time, these were well-known and well-discussed problems. Certainly here in the U.S., and I suspect, as you would know better than me, perhaps in Europe as well. So, we can debate the merits of it. I would note that. Almost 50, a little less than 50 U.S. senators at the time wrote a letter, kind of a non-traditional letter to the supreme leader in Iran saying, hey, you're making a deal with the Obama administration, but because it's not a treaty, it may not last beyond the administration. So
I recall that letter, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And a lot of people were critical of that. Reasonable people can disagree on whether that was appropriate. But you can't say that Iran and the world didn't have a warning that by not making it a treaty here in the United States that it may not, the agreement.
Well, that's a fair point, but it's a treaty to the rest of us, and the rest of us want to continue with it, notwithstanding the points that you make, some of which are extremely contested. For example, Brad, you said, as a matter of fact, that Iran is the main sponsor of terrorism in the world today, but most people believe it's the very quote-unquote democracy of Saudi Arabia that you are in defense of that is the main sponsor of terrorism. Just as a matter of interest, do you consider Saudi Arabia to be one of the democracies you're defending?
Well, if you look at any independent objective assessment of the state of civil liberties, freedom, political freedom in Saudi Arabia, I would say it would rate darn near the lowest. Freedom House here in the United States does a nice annual assessment. Saudi Arabia ranks horribly. That's been the tension in the U.S.-Saudi bilateral relationship from the beginning. We have some shared security interests, but a fundamental disagreement on basic democratic values and issues. So I think you and I would be more aligned than you might think. Well,
I'm glad to hear it. It's just that Jamal Khashoggi was a friend of mine, you see. Now he's cut up in pieces and dissolved in a vat of acid. And the regime that murdered him is the regime that is being prayed in aid in defense of U.S. policy towards Iran. And in short, I believe that your country's policy towards Iran is driven by Saudi Arabia and by Israel, but certainly by Saudi Arabia.
Well, sir, you're certainly entitled to your view as someone who's spent 9 years in the U.S. Senate. I would respectfully say that that's incorrect. I've been in the meetings with the highest level officials here from most of those countries as they've visited key members of the Senate. And I would tell you that my anecdotal experience in no way supports what you just said. I am focused on U.S. national security interests, which by and large historically has been aligned with international security interests. I don't really care too much for what Saudi Arabia wants. And I agree with you that the Khashoggi murder was horrific and that the regime in Saudi Arabia should be made to pay a price for that. Your audience may not know the Magnitsky sanctions that the U.S. Congress called for implementing. The historic passage of war powers legislation in the U.S. Congress, the first time ever, was largely related to the war in Yemen, was largely catalyzed by the murder of Khashoggi. So I hope your audience, I understand criticisms and concerns about the Trump administration, but we are a democracy here, and we do have three branches of government, and I hope that they don't take a monolithic view of the U.S. and ignore what's happening in the U.S. Congress as well, where the large majority of people would share your concern about what happened horribly to Mr. Khashoggi.
Well, you've done an excellent job of speaking up for it, I must say. You're an officer and a gentleman. By the way, exactly 14 years ago on this day, I myself was in the U.S. Senate. Look it up on YouTube. It was a bit of a red letter day. Brad Bowman, thanks for joining us. Brad Bowman, the director of the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies, the Centre of Military and Political Power. Walking on eggshells, don't you know? Here is an SMS. It's the neoliberal agenda rearing its ugly head in our country. Is it true that neoliberals bat for any team? It's said Barack Obama talked about how he would bring the people equality, fair wages, a good healthcare system. But towards the end of his very cleverly crafted speech, told them in no uncertain terms that he gave his loyalty to Wall Street. Are most politicians neoliberals now? Is Brexit a reaction against phony neoliberal politics? That's from Bewley in Lincoln. Good question, Bewley. It's true that the Republicans and the Democrats, and until Corbyn, for 20 years, Labour and the Conservatives were two cheeks of the same backside. The one thing that could be guaranteed in elections between the two are who would lose. The working people would lose. Corbyn, for a brief moment, moved mountains, pulled up trees. That's probably not the right metaphor for him because he's such a green fellow, but you know what I mean. He moved mountains. He really shook the establishment to its core. But I'm afraid that was the Corbyn of yesterday. I hope one day, maybe tomorrow, it will be a Corbyn like that again, but it isn't today. Shen says, listening to George Galloway only on Talk Radio tonight, all the way from Albania. A great start to my holiday weekend. Enjoy, Shen, in Albania, but do go carefully, sir. Sean Caden says, astonishing the political class still don't get it, that there is palpable anger among the masses, and far too many have lost faith in democracy. Ironically, now is the time to engage with democracy, as that's exactly what the charlatans in Westminster want you not to do. Sean, my condolences on the defeat of your team, Leeds United. I was very much hoping they'd make it to the playoff final and into the Premiership because I'm a huge admirer of their manager, but they were deservedly beaten, I've got to say, by a brilliant performance by Derby County. So congratulations to them. Now Terry Eaton says, Keir Starmer is promoting a second referendum, and this is a disgraceful attitude to take towards the electorate who voted to leave the EU. This man should not be negotiating on our behalf. It's a total tragedy. Let's take a call from Jeff in London. Go ahead, Jeff.
Hi, George. Thanks for taking my call.
Welcome, sir.
It was great a few weeks ago to see you outside Belmarsh Prison.
Oh, right, at Julian Assange's protest, yeah.
Yes, indeed. And also at the Imperialism on Trial event, which I thought was
There's more of those coming up, actually. There's
it's a series, isn't it?
Gregor told me there's 2 more coming up in June, I think. More particulars when they're available.
Well, that's great, and I hope we can somehow find out if Fred the Cabbie is out there somewhere.
Wouldn't it be nice to hear from him? Imagine the rejoicing in the land if someone now told me Fred the Cabbie is on the line.
It was. He had an uncanny amount of general knowledge, actually.
Totally uncanny. Totally. He was like the brain of Britain.
The wisest cabbie in Christendom.
That's how I dubbed him, and indeed he was.
I have to say, on this issue about Iran, I've noticed that the tensions are in the Persian Gulf, George. And it got me to thinking that the US, when it has tensions with China, where are they? The South China Sea. Yeah. And when the US has tensions with Russia, where are they? They're on the Ukrainian-Russian border with Ukraine and Poland and Baltics. And it reminded me of something Noam Chomsky said about the US's red lines. They're continually drawn at other countries' borders.
Yeah. These pesky Iranians, look how closely they've put their airspace to American aircraft.
Well, yeah, I mean, they even decided to bury American oil beneath something called the Persian Gulf.
Now, that is a paraphrase of my paraphrase of Donald Rumsfeld's. It's not our fault that God put America's oil under other people's countries.
Well, absolutely.
He essentially did say that.
He did, actually. It's almost beyond parody, but...
Yes.
It's quite astonishing, some of the things that got said during the Bush administration.
Speaking of parody, Jeff, there was a parody, or at least I thought it was a parody, in The Onion yesterday, which was John Bolton saying a non-lethal, quote-unquote, attack, which may have been from Wales, not Wales, on 2 empty Saudi oil tankers, which scratched their paint. He said, and I quote, this is John Bolton, "The attack on these 2 Saudi oil tankers is an attack on all Americans." And I thought it was a parody, but on further inspection, he actually did say that. Now, he is desperate for a war with Iran. Desperate. Question is, will Trump stand up to him?
Well, absolutely. I know you once described him as Mr. Pastry with IEDs.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
I think it reminded me actually of a very silly story about something about Russia had programmed whales, inky whales or something to disrupt Swedish shipping or something.
You could tell because they had snow on their boots.
They did. And I just think it's amazing because the previous guest talked about the treaty that America basically ripped up with Iran. It may not be a treaty under domestic American law, but it is actually under international law. It's a multilateral treaty, and it's actually backed up by an equally binding UN Security Council resolution. Now, there are provisions in there for a state to withdraw, but what actually has to happen is there has to be a major act of non-compliance has to be flagged up. There has to be deliberation in the Security Council, followed by a vote in the Security Council to validate that a major act of non-compliance has occurred. You can't just scupper out of the treaty in the way that America has done. And I have to say, when you look at the nuclear treaty that America withdrew from with Russia, the Paris Climate Change Treaty, which America withdrew from, I mean, America's word is mud in the world at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, and even amongst people that were traditionally allied with the United States, and that was a point I was trying gently to make to our Washington guest. But what you have just said is true in every particular. If I had wanted to be less polite with our guest, I would have made those points myself, but it might have taken a long time then out of the show to argue the toss. But the fact that the US Senate did not ratify this as a treaty is absolutely immaterial, because for the reasons you gave, it is a binding resolution of the United Nations Security Council. It is a treaty for everybody else, and it can only be abrogated if a major act of non-compliance has been thrashed out in the Security Council. And not only has there been no major non-compliance, there's been no minor non-compliance. Indeed, Iran has implemented the JCPOA in absolutely pristine, unblemished fashion.
Yeah.
But, the American political class, God knows what the public think, but the American political class are so intoxicated with their own exceptionality that they think that they can do these kind of things, and that we will applaud them, support them, maybe even help them.
Well, I think Iran should be forewarned, George, because remember what Donald Trump said, I think was it last week or the week before? He said, really, what Cuba's doing in Venezuela is so bad that America might actually have to put sanctions on Cuba.
I did laugh out loud. I did laugh out loud about that. It is distinctly possible that Donald Trump had forgotten that the United States has had sanctions on Cuba for 60 years. Although I'm bound to tell you, I'm in a position to tell you, that Trump negotiated with the communist authorities in Havana about opening a Trump Tower in Havana before he became president. And no doubt will after he leaves office.
Well, there you go. I mean, and it's always... I do agree with what you said to the guest, though, about... You said that Trump may feel that he's been led down the garden path somewhat in Venezuela. I think that it's true as well with Iran, because someone convinced Trump, maybe it was Pompeo or Bolton or one of these people, that you withdraw from the nuclear treaty and Iran's going to come running back with a begging bowl. He now knows that's not going to happen.
Well, the absolute opposite. Again, I tried politely to point this out. The Iranians as a people and the Iranian leadership are exactly the sort of people who do not respond to threats. And I just saw a quote from the Supreme Leader Khamenei that the United States has made the Iranian people hate them 10 times more than they already hated them. So the truth is, if Trump phoned up Khamenei wouldn't take the call. Even Rouhani, I think, would not take the call. The Iranians are ready to fight the Americans if the Americans are stupid enough to attack them. That's the long and the short of it.
It is, and I think that when you look at the situation in Iran, last year you had the crisis with the price of bread and eggs, flour and eggs, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And America was talking about, there are protests going on. Why do you think those protests are going on? It's because of American sanctions.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, talk about hypocrisy. Then they feign concern about these people rising up against their leaders. I mean, almost like, if they suffer any more, we're going to have to go in with military force. I mean, the reason they're protesting is because the prices have shot up because of that's the price of U.S. sanctions on the
look, we've seen this playbook now so often before. It is astounding that sentient beings in the media and the political class, especially as the word Iran is different in only one letter from the word Iraq. The arguments being made about the need to threaten and, if necessary, fight Iran are precisely the words that were used to talk us into the disaster of the Iraq war and occupation. Only one letter is different. Jeff, it's a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much indeed for that call. Terry Eaton says, no, I've done that one. Adam Gary, the cleverest man in England, says if the Tories pick Boris, they'll have something in common with Labour. A leader whom many people like, but a party that almost everyone hates. If they don't pick Boris, the long-term future will be between Farage leading his party and Corbyn following his. And Elford says Boris Johnson, as leader of the opposition, makes a lot of sense and is not necessarily representing just the poor judgment of a party in panic. Jason McCartney is one to watch in the longer term for real, stable party unity in the Westminster cockpit. Who's Jason McCartney? My God, I'm getting old. I've never even heard of that name. Can someone tell me who that is? Ryan says, I find it absolutely enraging that the government that's betraying Brexit axed 20,000 police, leaked national security, oversaw Grenfell, Windrush, and bunged the DUP £1 billion it was, Ryan, are using their own nepotism to appoint our next Prime Minister. Enough's enough, general election time. Well, I predicted today on my American television show that if Boris Johnson is the leader, that he will go for an early election, which means, of course, that every one of the Blairite Labour MPs will be re-elected. What could possibly go wrong? Andy Graham says, and so it continues. Galloway tells the truth to those who are wise enough to tune in to talk radio and listen. A pity, is it not, that the parliamentarians are not listening? They might learn a thing or two. Trust me, Andy, some of them are. Patrick Vidine says Professor Cole is right. Democracy is not the same as a system of government. We've never had a true democracy in the UK, and the main reason for that is political parties dilute and mask the will of the people. Only independent individuals should be MPs. DRMR Cole, C-O-L-E, that's Dr. Cole's Twitter handle for those that have been asking for it. Well, that's the end of the second hour, which leaves us only 1 hour to go. So you better get your calls in now. 0344 499 1000. It's the mother of all talk shows. It's the Open University of the Airwaves. It's the College of Knowledge. And there are no tuition fees at all, thanks to the capitalist messages. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call.
Outspoken, challenging, opinionated. The mother of all talk shows, George Galloway on Talk Radio.
Now, Edward Wilson is an author I have only recently discovered, but I've now read 1.5 of his books, and I'm going to read every single one of them. The half is South Atlantic Requiem, and you'll see Edward on a subsequent, I think not tomorrow, but next Saturday, of my Sputnik television show on Sky 511. He is an American. He's a decorated American military officer. He was in the Vietnam War. and his first book was about Vietnam. War is a theme with him. How could it be otherwise? Because it is a theme of our lifetime. It's been one long bloody war, and the United States has been in all of them, and more or less so have we. War, conflict, ideological clash is the very stuff, of course, of spy novels. And for someone who's been at the front line, literally, Edward Wilson is really a terrific writer. I'm glad to say he joins us now. Edward, welcome.
Thank you, George, for your generous praise. Not a word of which I would disagree with. By the way, I consider myself British now, having taken nationality and renounced.
Well, you're welcome. You've even managed to lose the American accent, so you're doubly welcome.
Well, that's part of being that's part of my spy training, was to. but actually, one of my own favourite spy novelists is Erskine Childers.
A terrific author, yeah.
And not only because the Riddle of the Sands is so wonderful, but I just think Erskine Childers had the ultimate accolade for a writer of spy fiction. He was executed by a firing squad for being a spy.
Yes, that's exactly correct. I hope that doesn't happen to you, at least not until you've got all these books out of your system, because I know you've even got one almost finished now. But let's talk about the one that's on the market now. I said earlier in the show that considering the Falklands War was such a big part of the 1980s. It was a major conflict for a start. A lot of people were killed, most of them Argentine, but a lot of British people were killed. Many more were maimed. It was a conflict which erupted out of nowhere for most people over a rocky outcrop in the South Atlantic, on which 2,300 people lived and 100,000 or 200,000 sheep. And it seemed almost comic opera until the blood started flowing. But it made the premiership of Margaret Thatcher, saved her from what looked at that point, because I was there, I was a full-time Labour organiser at the time, looked like electoral defeat was looming for her in 1983. So it changed the course of British political history as well as international affairs. And yet, there's virtually no drama or fiction about it. And you've now filled that vacuum, and hats off to you for doing so.
Well, thank you for that, George. But the interesting thing, the first half of my novel is actually talking about the sheer, utter incompetence of Margaret Thatcher in the run-up to that war. A lot of British people don't realise is it wasn't the first time we sent a task force to the South Atlantic. It happened in 1977 when the Labour Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan, sent a task force. It was a small task force, 2 frigates, a submarines, and a couple of support vessels. And what had happened in 1977 was the Argentines were probing, and they landed 50 scientists on an island called South Fuel, windswept, totally useless. And the scientists, of course, were probably Argentine Marines, and it was a bluff, just seeing what Britain would do next. And James Callaghan sent 2 frigates, a submarine, and 2 support vessels secretly, and that ended the situation. Now, the so-called Iron Lady, 5 years later, when, again, 50 Argentines landed on South Georgia pretending to be scrap metal merchants, she did nothing except make diplomatic protestations. And the Argentines knew what they were doing, because earlier, 2 years before that, she had sent Nicholas Ridley to do a sovereignty deal, sort of giving the Falklands to the Argentines under a lease-back agreement, which would have been a fantastic deal for Britain.
Well, it would have been far better for everyone involved.
Yeah. So,
and it was the Thatcher government that was ready to do it. It was the Callaghan government that sent the task force. It was the Thatcher government that withdrew it. It was the Thatcher government that sent Ridley to discuss essentially a joint sovereignty deal, then didn't do it, and then the invasion happened, and everything that flowed, especially the blood that came after.
Totally true, and somehow I think people, people hope reading my novel will realise, the sheer hypocrisy, incompetence, not being able to manage a Welk star of Margaret Thatcher, and so when this disaster happened. Do you remember Michael Foot's speech?
Of course I do, yes.
And which almost...
I listened to it live, actually, on the radio.
It was almost, in retrospect, I almost thought that Michael Foot was auditioning for the Churchill role in The Finest Hour.
Yes.
And
speak for England, the Tories were shouting.
And I agreed with his speech. And I thought we did need to make the gesture, the saber-rattling gesture of sending that task force south. I know that Tam Dalyell didn't agree with that. By the way, I was at the Edinburgh Festival with Tam Dalyell a couple of years before he died, and and he said to me...
The Falklands became Tam's life's work, actually.
It was, and he did a brilliant job of it. And he actually talked to Michael Foot after that speech and said, "Why have you given this speech?" And Michael Foot said to Tam, "I think I know more about fighting fascism than you do." And by the way, the thing that earlier in your program,
that was a bit risky, considering Tam was a tank officer in the Second World War.
Indeed, and
and Michael was a journalist in Fleet Street.
A bit ironic, yes. But I do think that that what you said earlier in the program is there is something in the British DNA. It doesn't like fascism.
No, quite.
And I know a load of us on the left are often always criticising Britain for atrocities like the Irish potato famine, which killed 12% of the population. The massacre at Amritsar.
100 years today.
Yes. And it just the other thing, but as a anti-establishment lefty and very proud to have a British passport, I would like to say that we should also look at things like Karl Marx. Dr. Karl Marx did not write his works in Paris or Berlin or New York. He wrote them in the British Museum in London. And I think that says something about...
It says something about the way we were. Whether it's the way we are now, ask Julian Assange that.
I think that's a very good point. Yes, so totally agree. But now that you mentioned Julian Assange, actually he's a fan of my... I'm very proud to say he's a fan of my books as well.
Well, you've got a lot of... I'm just looking at some of the quotes, Edward. Clive Ponting, who, of course, had a really big and important role in this whole Falklands affair. I think he went to prison, didn't he?
Oh, no, he didn't go to prison, but no thanks to the judge. I'm glad you mentioned Clive Ponting, because he's given me a very generous
terrific. He said he said you were on a par with John le Carre, and that your story about the Falklands was very well researched and accurate, and gets nearer the truth of what happened in the Falklands War than any of the standard histories. So that's praise indeed, and shows that fiction can often be truer than fact.
Well, the great thing about writing historical fiction, historical spy fiction, is you can continue linking up the dots after the documents have disappeared.
Yeah.
And I really want to say, I think Clive Ponting is one of the heroes of the Falklands War. He wasn't in physical danger. He wasn't going to have his legs blown off by a landmine or his head blown off by a B-40 rocket. But what he did risk 14 years in prison for exposing the government's lies. And the government lies he exposed, actually it was to Tam Diel he gave those lies. I mean, it wasn't exactly he was exposing this to a foreign state. He
was exposing it to a senior parliamentarian.
Yes, and a war hero.
Yes.
And it was unbelievable. And the three lies that Clive Ponting risked, I mean that's 14 years. He could have spent more time in prison than Klaus Fuchs, who gave nuclear secrets to Moscow. And the three lies that Clive Ponting exposed were: one, the Belgrano never went into the total exclusion zone.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Where you could be sunk. Two, the Belgrano, when it was torpedoed, was actually on the way back to its home port.
Yes.
But the most important lie that Clive Ponting exposed was the British, the task force did not discover the Belgrano for the first time on the 2nd of May. They discovered the Belgrano for the first time on the 1st of May. Now, this is really important, because when the task force commander, Sandy Woodward, asked London for permission to sink the Belgrano, it was firmly denied. They were refused. 1st of May, refused permission to sink the Belgrano. 2nd of May, as the Belgrano is steaming full speed ahead back to its home port, hey presto, sinker. So what happened between the 1st of May and the 2nd of May that London changed her mind, I should say, about this?
Well, we know. Maybe we should put a spoiler alert in here, because it's a significant part of the book. Let me say it succinctly this: the Argentines sought peace.
And they sought peace big time, because basically what the Argentines never wanted to go to war. The reason they didn't want to go to war was because they know they would lose. Let's look at the maths, the arithmetic of what was on the sea. The Royal Navy sent 44 ships, surface ships, and 3 submarines to the South Atlantic. The Argentines had 9 ships. They knew that their bluff had been called, and at midnight between the 1st and 2nd of May, they, using the Peruvian president, Ballinde, they agreed to a peace deal, with which is a peace deal which was gave the Argentines the skimpiest of
exits. It gave them an exit strategy. Perez de Cuellar came up with and helped develop this peace plan, and Mrs. Thatcher by then did not want it. And one. Well, the question is, it seems pretty obvious
she sank that ship to torpedo the peace plan.
Yeah, sure. Look, in the time available, I want to just ask you a more general question. As I mentioned to you earlier this week, I went with some old comrades of mine to see a film, a brilliant film with Dame Judi Dench, directed by Trevor Nunn. You can still see it at the cinema. It's called Red Joan. My daughter actually alerted me to it. It's about a woman, Melita Norwood, that I knew for 20 years, though I quickly add I did not know that she was an agent of the KGB, if indeed she was, but she confessed to being so. And it struck me then when I was reading your book, the enduring attraction and appeal of spy fiction. How do you explain that, especially so long after the end of the actual Cold War, when there were two existentially threatening ideologies confronting each other?
I think the more perceptive readers of spy fiction realize that good spy writers, in which I include myself, have done a lot of research and are telling the truth about what happened behind the scenes, and not the propaganda you get from the
official histories and memoirs.
I cannot understand how anyone can be a historian. I mean, I think that must be the most difficult job in the world, because basically the information by the people in power, the governments, they drip feed and they sanitize the information. And I know historian friends hate it when I say
could be worse, Ted. I'm making a film about Dr. David Kelly, and all the important paperwork's locked up until my youngest child will be dead.
Oh, wow. I didn't know you were going to mention that. That is one... George,
can we do a novel on that? Can you do a joint novel? Let's do it.
If you want to do it together, let me know. I went to I was hosted at a literary event. And at this event afterwards, I don't know exactly what his title was. I think he might have been sort of chief medical officer for London, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know his name, but he actually said we were talking about the Kelly murder. Let's call it what it was. It was a murder. And he was telling me that he personally had been petitioning the coroners. Where was it? In Somerset, was it? Where he was killed?
No, Oxfordshire.
Oxfordshire. And he was actually, several of them were petitioning the coroner to reopen. You know, the case has never been reopened. And the reason it's never been reopened is because somehow the government has a veto over it.
Yes, although a change of government can change the veto because it has no legal power. The locking up of the Kelly papers was an act of fiat by the judge in the inquiry. It wasn't a statutory inquiry, and therefore any fiat of his has no statutory force. And so any government, either this one or the next one, and if as long as I've got breath, I'm going to be pushing for it. And when people see my film, they're going to be pushing for it too. Edward, I've got to go now. I thoroughly recommend your work. Edward Wilson, author of The South Atlantic Requiem and other brilliant novels, spy novels, on a par with John le Carré. And you can't say higher than that. The Red Resistance says, I've always had a bee in my bonnet about the practical side of democracy, namely how we vote. Is there any reason why I can click an app and transfer my entire wage to wherever I want? Yet I have to trudge to a village hall on a Thursday to vote. There's no reason at all. And it is actually really stupid. And it is a barrier to participation in democracy. We should be voting over a weekend, a Saturday and a Sunday, so that we don't have to do it before we go to work or rush on the way back from work. We should be doing it online, in the supermarket, in the church, in the workplace. We can do it anywhere, on a machine, with a properly accredited electronic card, the kind that we transfer thousands of pounds potentially from our bank accounts to other places, other accounts. There's absolutely no reason why it needs to be on a Thursday, in a council, in the rain, in between work, getting your dinner and all the rest. It is actually really stupid. Andrew says if members of Parliament behaved themselves a bit better at PMQs instead of howling like a pack of hungry hyenas, they'd have more respect. Patrick says, as George knows and disagrees with, I think, I advocate for a purer form of representative democracy, #pure democracy, which would lead to electoral contests between capable, trusted, ethical and local individuals, perhaps 20 per constituency. #choice. Marie McFarlane says Labour's biggest mistake after making plenty of money from our memberships from 2015 onwards was not putting in transport and help for poor, disabled, working class people to attend national conferences. A total barrier to democracy. Let's hear from Nicola in Swindon. Always a pleasure, Nicola.
Yes, always a pleasure to talk to you, George. Yes,
thank you.
I'm not actually in Swindon at the moment. I'm heading towards Swindon on a train, so if I lose you abruptly, I've not cut you off. It's just I've gone out of range. But,
all right.
No, I've been listening to your show. Excellent show again. And I quite agree with you. If we can transfer thousands of pounds between bank accounts from our home, from our computer, we should be able to vote. It's not beyond the realms of possibility.
Not at all. I also think, I know that other people don't like them. I like them partly because I always win them. But I really like referendum. I think we should have more referendums. And if we've got the electronic tools with which to do it, there's lots of things that can be put to a purer form of democracy, namely a referendum. People can be voting on all kinds of things. I think
a lot of other countries have a lot more of them than we do.
Well,
but
that's right.
But we need to specify them better.
Yeah.
Mr. Cameron's referendum was so hairy-fairy that everybody thought they were voting.
Well, we'll read all about it in his book if we buy it.
Some people thought they were just voting against Cameron, and they used it as a vote against him, and other people voted for all various reasons.
To be fair, it was a vote against Cameron and Blair and Major and was it old Vince at the time or who? No, it was Clegg, wasn't it?
Yes.
They were voting against the political class in the country, and why not?
Well, that's it. But unfortunately, that wasn't what the vote was about. So I know the one. I mean, I voted to leave for similar reasons to you did, but a lot of people voted for so many different things, and we can now see from the Houses of Parliament that the complete disarray we're in because everybody's interpretation of Brexit is different.
Yeah, but they're doing it deliberately. It's not genuine, Nicola.
Oh, I know. We're no further forward now than we were 2 years ago.
No.
And in Parliament...
And as a long-time listener, you'll know that I said on the first night that there's no need for an Article 50. There's no need for anything. Just send them an email and say, our people have instructed us to leave the EU. And here's the basis on which we are leaving.
Yes, you did say that. And I think you probably said that to me on the phone because I remember ringing you just after the referendum. And, but of course, there's so much gone on now. There's so many other things. Things are being blamed on Brexit. We don't know where we are with the state of the country because we're stockpiling stuff for Brexit. There's people who are about 3 or 4 months ahead with their production because they're frightened something will happen that will alter the flow of the material for their products.
Yeah.
And I mean, I live in Swindon, and Honda are threatening to pull out.
Yeah, nothing to do with Brexit.
No, but people are running around in Swindon like headless chickens.
Well, you know my view. I said it a couple of weeks ago. If Honda don't want to make motor cars in Swindon, we will on their plant and machinery, which we helped to buy.
Yeah, it's rail served. It's a huge location.
It's rail served. The workers are there. The designers are there. We can build our own motor cars.
And we should build electric cars as well.
Even better. Nicola, I must press on. Thanks for the call. It's always also a pleasure to hear from Daniel in Addleston. Daniel.
Good evening, George. How are you?
Very well, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, no, good. No, I wanted to talk about this Brexit thing because we've had this kicking can. I don't know if you remember, it was like last year or a year and a half ago, they were kicking the can down the road.
Yes.
I mean, this can must be knackered by now. There's nothing left of it.
Nothing left of it, yeah.
But no, all the while, I remember listening to you a couple of months ago, and you had David Ellis on your show, and he spoke about EU defence union.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah, that is going ahead full steam. People, again, I'm sorry, George, but, the fact that no one in Parliament is talking about what people can Google and see what all the European leaders, all their defence leaders are talking about, unifying their defence. Like, that's the whole point of the European Union, to unify everything.
Yeah.
And that is why, do you not find that a bit strange that no one in Parliament is talking about this?
No. In fact, when we talked about it in the referendum, they said we were making it up. They said it was a conspiracy theory.
I mean, but again, this is coming from the honest Parliament, Theresa May making promises.
Yeah. Well, I don't want a European army. I think I have bad memories of European armies, not just the ones we fought, but the ones we were fighting alongside. I really don't want a European army. I wouldn't trust the defence of my country to a European army. I'm quite happy to have our own army, our own navy, and our own air force to defend our own country. Thanks very much. Daniel, thanks. I think I've lost you, but I need to read you this really important tweet. It's from Sean Caden, and for some reason he knew what I did not know. He says this: "This is the last mother of all talk shows from Hatfield's Talksport Towers. Some great memories in that joint for you, George. I remember when I first saw the kitchen. Talk about a health warning. And I swear there was penicillin in the fridge. Those were the days. Those were the days when Talksport was a rude, anarchic, rumbustious, utterly brilliant radio station, unlike any radio station anywhere else in the country, maybe anywhere else in the world. And I was on Friday nights and Saturday nights from 10 p.m. till 1 in the morning, so getting the drinks trade, if you know what I mean. 2 nights a week, 6 hours a week, and it was a riot. Such a riot that they're actually still, the recordings are still bestsellers on YouTube today. I've got radio clips from those TalkSport days that I've got hits in the millions. Imagine. Not only were people switching off their television to listen to radio on a Friday and Saturday night, not only were people staying in on a Friday and Saturday night, and one of them's nodding at me now, much to the detriment of their relationships with others who weren't that keen, that 10 years later, millions of people are still listening on YouTube to some of those encounters. And this is my last night here, because next week I'll be in Russia getting the results of the European Parliament elections. I'll let you know once I've picked them up. And it's next week that the entire show is moving to the new headquarters building. If I could, I really would stay here in Hatfields forever. I love it so much, even the penicillin in the fridge. James Whale will be covering for me next week between 7 and 10, and God willing, I'll be back the following week. But if you follow me on Twitter, Facebook and so on, you'll hear plenty of what I'm saying and thinking about the European Parliament elections, which will be, of course, next Thursday. David Woolnough says, I'm loyally trying to believe that Jeremy Corbyn will do right by the UK Labour movement and install some socialism into this country. Mountain Man says, the only thing you can believe about history are the names of the kings and queens, said Oscar Wilde. I haven't seen that quote before. It's a very good one, actually. The Communicipalist says democracy is now vilified as a right-wing aspiration in the mainstream media. I think this is post-truth politics, a collapse into absurdity, orchestrated by nudgers and advertising professionals. The problem with UK politics is it's not political enough. That's a good line, actually, a good quote. The problem with UK politics is it's not political enough. Patrick says, by the way, George, I did take a couple of weeks off from Moats, also had a wee break, but I can assure you my time was not wasted. UFOlogy is also a passion of mine. There's more than one University of the Airways, even though yours is one of the best. Talk about damned by faint praise. There's more than one University of the Airwaves, even though yours is one of the best. Patrick. Let's hear from Joe in London. Go ahead, Joe.
Good evening, George.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, I'm a first-time caller.
Welcome, especially welcome.
I just wanted to pick up on what you were talking about earlier about the way that we vote, and it's something that's bothered me a lot, and I've been thinking about it, and I think this might be a good time for this sort of thing to be implemented. I mean, we rely on people, and we have to trust them, and this has shown, what's happened over the last few years, is that they can't be trusted.
That's right. We need a new charter, don't we? You remember the Chartists?
A new way of doing things. I mean, I think the way we're doing things, really, frankly, I think is primitive. I mean, it sort of stems from someone in Cumbria, or a village in Cumbria, needs to be represented in London. And years ago, transportation systems meant that you couldn't really get down to London on every single issue. So you have to send somebody to represent your village, be that Tony or Alistair or someone like that. Trouble is, you've got to be able to trust them, that they're going to put the village's interests in the forefront, even if it is in conflict with their own. But we don't live in that world anymore, and we haven't done for quite some time. And now I think it's time for us to change the way we vote. And you were talking about the methods, and we've now got things like blockchain. Most people probably aware of blockchain in terms of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, but its use is far, far more powerful than that.
Well, it could be easily used for multi-referenda. It can
definitely.
Be easily used as a secure way of casting your vote electronically.
That's right, absolutely. And I think I agree with you as well that we need to have more referenda and the people more involved.
Yeah.
Because
there are some things
in general, I think people come up with the right answers. If you go to a fairground and you've got a jar of gobstoppers or whatever, and somebody has to try and guess how many are in that jar, it has been shown that mathematicians don't do as well as the average of the general public. They seem to somehow get very close to the right number.
Well,
the spread is huge.
Experts are out of fashion and out of favour, Joe. Listen, Don't be a stranger. Make your second call soon. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. Good points. Let's hear from Tina in the bush, in Shepherd's Bush.
Hello, George. How are you?
Very well. The better for hearing from you, the first woman caller of the night.
I just want to thank you for your performance on This Week last night. I could have sworn you were readmitted to the Labour Party.
No, because if I was in the Labour Party, I wouldn't have defended Jeremy Corbyn in the way that I did, would I? Because nobody else does.
It's absolutely disgusting. My TV just about survived Ian Austin last night. It's absolutely defamatory and disgusting. I know you can't talk about that, but it's just shocking, and I'm so glad that you came on and you wiped the smile off Melanie On's face. I've never heard of her. I've never seen her.
No, it came as some. I mean, if I'd arrived from Mars, I certainly would never have known she was a Labour MP, because her entire purpose on the show was to damage Labour.
Absolutely, but it didn't work. They just looked like the sour, just nasty people that they are. Ian Austin should be up for re-election as well. He's not that Oh, I'm so
well,
mad.
no, don't get angry
Yeah.
because you might say the wrong thing. So let me finish what you were going to say. It's this: the Change UK people are demanding a people's vote on Brexit, whilst refusing a people's vote in their own constituencies to validate their defection from the colours under which they were elected. That's how democratic they are. Tina, thanks for that. Anthony is in South Wales. Go ahead, Anthony. Anthony, are you there? Yeah, we've lost Anthony in South Wales. I always like to talk to South Wales. I think the paraphernalia of Parliament is bad for democracy, says the Red Resistance. All this right honourable this, Mr Speaker that, black rod, maces, men in tights with swords, sedentary position, open questions, closed questions, etc. All designed to keep the oiks out. We've got Anthony in South Wales. Let's hear from him. Anthony,
Hello,
welcome.
George. How are you?
I'm good. The better for hearing from you. Go ahead.
Right then, I'm phoning up. Like, this EU referendum's coming up now. I work on site. I work with a lot of builders, right? And I would say about 90% of us all voted to leave. The problem is with this EU referendum now, right? At least 50% of them is not even going to bother voting because why is the point of voting? I have talked to two of my friends and say, just go out and put your mark on there. Like, we got a Brexit party to vote for. Let's go and do it. But everyone else just say, I'm just not going to bother voting again, probably in their lifetime.
Well, there is a very real danger that people will stop voting if their votes are not counted, if their votes are stolen from them. But just tell your mates this, Anthony, that is exactly what the people who are stealing their votes want. They exactly want people to stop voting.
I've been saying that to them, but they're just they're so upset, and most of them are very angry that they just can't see the point in it.
Well, that's part of the danger that I tried to highlight both earlier this evening, but also on many other occasions. That, you see, if not democracy, then what? You see, that's the real danger of this, one which is consistently underestimated by those who are trying to cheat the referendum result, that there's a danger to social peace in the country. There's a danger of the bottom falling out of the bucket of a democratic system in Britain, with all the dangers that represents. So please, I beg you, tell your workmates, stopping voting is not the answer. In fact, the powerful want you to stop voting. Anthony, I must press on. Martin is in Newington. Go ahead, Martin.
Hello, George. I'm pleased to speak to you before you set off for Moscow.
Yes.
Try to go to St. Petersburg if you can. Spectacular place.
Yes.
But anyway, so many things to say, and I wanted to read Corbyn. I will ask a question that he hasn't asked. Now, you may know the answer. Who said this? We are not prepared to accept, they said it in Parliament, we are not prepared to accept the principle that the most vital economic forces of this country should be handed over to an authority that is utterly undemocratic and is responsible to nobody. Who said that, George?
I think it was Mr. Ben.
Clement Attlee in 1950.
Attlee in 45, 46, yeah.
Yeah, no, you see, he said it in 1950.
Actually, I've heard Mr. Ben say it, and he was quoting Attlee. You're absolutely right.
Exactly. And Attlee also said it might make close ties with the Commonwealth and the US more difficult. Again, absolutely prophetic. And what Corbyn has failed to nail home, that it's the Tories who took us into the what is now the EU. Attlee refused to join. He refused to join. He declined to join the EU's front runner, which was the European Coal and Steel Community. And later on, it was Harold Macmillan who reversed the position in 1963 and sought membership with the EEC. Do you see?
And was famously refused with General de Gaulle's no. I'll tell you something else, Martin. Yes. I'll tell you something else that he hasn't done. Yeah. And this is why I'm so angry about John McDonnell's statement that Jeremy and I are Remainers at heart. Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, me, the late and great John Smith, Dennis Canavan, Dennis Skinner, hundreds of us in Parliament fought the Maastricht Treaty tooth and nail. We kept the Tories up all night. We wrecked their business. We filibustered. We created guerrilla politics on the floor of the House of Commons to destroy the Maastricht Treaty. The same Maastricht Treaty and single market and customs union that Labour MPs are now ready to die to defend. How did that happen? Precisely. Why did that happen?
Yes,
what's the intellectual justification for that happening? Mr. McDonnell, when did you change from wanting to wreck the Maastricht Treaty, to being a supporter of it at heart? When? Last word to you, Martin.
Unbelievable. Well, I agree with everything you said there. But what's interesting was even in the 60s, Clement Attlee reportedly told a newspaper that he was not keen on the common market. He said, after all, we beat Germany and we beat Italy and we saved France and Belgium and Holland. I never see why we should go crawling to them. It's a Labour Prime Minister.
What a very good quote. I wish I'd said that. I will. Thank you, Martin, as ever. Last call of the night from Jamie in Surrey. Go ahead, Jamie.
Oh, hi, George. I spoke to you last year. We still seem to be in the EU. I'm not quite sure how that happened.
That's a very good point. I keep looking at the calendar and wondering how we're still there.
I don't know, but there's plenty of people in Parliament to make sure that we stay there, isn't there? So,
yeah.
Speaking of which, one was on Channel 4 News this evening, Steve Kinnock, and I couldn't believe my ears, but this guy was basically saying, well, we need to agree to a deal like May's deal because we need to put it onto the referendum to basically essentially overturn it, because obviously nobody's going to vote for a May deal. And therefore you have to vote Remain. I mean, the second referendum is basically a revocation referendum by any other name.
Yeah. Well, the Kinnocks have done extremely well, of course, out of the European Union. Father, mother, wife, sister, all of them have been at the font of many euros for many years in the European Union, and have pensions to make your eye water to prove it. But I don't think anyone any longer is listening to people like that. Certainly not the 17.5 million. And added to them, Jamie, are those who didn't vote Leave, but who believe in democracy and recognise the danger of betraying democracy. Recognise what the alternative to democracy is. Recognise what grave consequences there can be if democracy goes out of favour and people fall out of faith in it. It's a very, very